Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. This daily show goes year by year presenting a linear history of our 250 years as a nation. If this is your first time listening to the show, welcome aboard. We began the show with 1776, so go back and check it out from the beginning. And if you've already been listening to the show, welcome back. Now let's get into the episode. With the worst of the Revolutionary War now behind us, the conflict transforms and is less about open battles. There is now a greater emphasis placed on diplomacy and the development of a united America. The Siege of Yorktown massively crippled Cornwallis' army, but British forces still hold key cities and loyalist sentiment persists. Across the Atlantic, Parliament debates peace, while on American soil, blood continues to be shed in western forests and in southern swamps. From Philadelphia's financial halls to Paris negotiation tables, this year continues to shape a nation on the cusp of victory. Welcome to 1782 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and we begin this year by reading from the journal of William Scudder, an officer in the late New York line who was taken captive by the Indians at Fort Stanwix in 79 and is currently being held as prisoner in Canada. It being New Year's Day, I again went to church, but must mention that this morning Mr. and Mrs. Hill received visits from several of their relations and acquaintances to express their joy and congratulate them on the day, and at the same time took occasion to mention that they wished me all the earthly happiness this world can afford, and with every mark of fervency desired my release, and expressed a hope that before this year had revolved round, a peace might be established between England and America on a firm and lasting basis. I do, with a profound respect to the great governor of the universe, sincerely implore his aid to impede the long and distressing judgments that have spread through the lands of America, and that before another New Year's Day shall arrive, peace with her balmy wings might bless the land, that the 13 United States may be a free and independent people and become a rising and happy empire, and an example of goodness in returning their tribute of praise for so signal a salvation from threatened ruin, and that my little lyre may join in praising Jehovah. Amen. Now, let's take a moment and recap the current state of the war. The decisive win at Yorktown had caused the British to change plans, but there hasn't been any retraction of a declaration of war. There are no orders to begin withdrawing yet, and there are 30,000 British and German troops in the country. The British firmly control New York City, Charleston, and Savannah, as well as possessing East Florida and Canada, and occupying forts scattered in loyalist strongholds on the frontier. The goal, however, at least inside the 13 states, is no longer to aggressively push for more territorial control. Because of this, much of the fighting has calmed down, with no major troop movements and giant fields of battle, but the violence remains. Consider these following numbers approximations, as hard and fast head counts are a little tricky and are still debated to this day. If you include Continentals, there are currently somewhere between 25 and 30,000 men fighting as patriots. According to John Adams' estimate, about 40% of America's 2.5 million citizens are firm patriots in terms of actively supporting independence, even if they're not in the militia or army. Roughly 300,000 to 400,000 share loyalist goals, and their total manpower is probably just over 10,000. There are also some allies in the Indian tribes that play a role in frustrating westward expansion and generally side with the British. In the south and north, where British power is concentrated, loyalists naturally tend to gather in greater numbers, and in these areas is where the conflict is now mostly localized. Somewhat of a civil war is taking place inside this Revolutionary War, as Americans fight Americans to gain or retake garrisons and forts. One such battle takes place on January 3rd. A small but fierce clash in South Carolina's Low Country takes place at Vidau's Bridge. Colonel Richard Richardson Jr., son of the late Brigadier General Richard Richardson, leads a Patriot militia of over 400 men against a British force under Major William Brereton. The British, numbering about 360, hold a fortified position at Vidau's Bridge near the Wando River. Richardson, aided by a detachment of cavalry, circles north to strike the bridge. The Patriots fire from the tree line, but Brereton's men, including the New York Volunteers and South Carolina Royalists, hold firm. After a sharp engagement, the British counterattack, routing the Patriots. 4 days later, on January 7th, the Bank of North America opens its doors as the first commercial bank in the United States. Superintendent of Finance Robert Morris spearheads this effort to stabilize the war-torn economy. The bank, located on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, issues notes backed by gold and silver, aiming to restore confidence in American currency after the continental dollar's collapse. Thomas Willing, the bank's first president, oversees an initial capital of $400,000, much of it from French loans and private investors. The bank's ledgers are filled with entries showing early loans to the Continental Army, funding uniforms and muskets. This institution marks a significant step toward financial independence, a quiet but critical victory in the Revolution and the building of a new nation. On January 15th, Robert Morris stands before Congress in Philadelphia, urging another bold step: a national mint and decimal coinage. In a report, Morris argues that a standardized currency will unify the states and simplify trade, replacing the chaotic mix of British pounds, Spanish dollars, and barter that has been filling the void. His proposal suggests a system where 100 units equal $1, a radical departure from European models, though Russia has been using decimal currency for over 70 years by this point. Congress listens intently, but no action is taken for now, as war demands much of their focus. Morris' vision, though, plants a seed for America's economic future and for a nation looking to innovate on what they have known under British rule. The British increasingly have bigger fish to fry than a revolting former colony halfway around the world, but this is an existential battle for America, and it has caused tremors felt globally. On February 17th, French and British fleets clash in the Indian Ocean, the two nations having been at war since '78. What's notable here isn't that there is some huge win for either side, but that as the French Navy engages a British squadron under Admiral Edward Hughes, they are able to avoid losing any ships. The Royal Navy has a fierce reputation, commanding the seas and thus global trade. Simply taking damage and not losing any ships in an exchange such as this is a testament to the growing capability of the French Navy, currently America's greatest ally. Back to Philadelphia, on February 21st, Congress takes a historic step, resolving that Congress is to approve the establishment of a mint. This resolution, though not immediately implemented, signals intent to create a national currency as the national legislature increasingly makes planning for the future part of their objectives. 3 days later, South Carolina's swamps see another clash at the Battle of Wamba. The British want to punish and disrupt Patriot militia activity in the Low Country, and a Patriot militia under Colonel Archibald MacDonald, numbering about 100 men, faces a British force led by Colonel Benjamin Thompson near Wamba Creek. The British, a mix of cavalry, infantry, and loyalist militia, surprise the Patriots at Wamba Bridge, scattering them with well-drilled volleys of fire, and the Americans lose 44, while the British report no losses. The next morning, British and Loyalist forces push forward, aiming to consolidate their success. Word of yesterday's disaster reaches the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, while he attends the South Carolina General Assembly. He immediately rides toward the Wamba with a small but determined force and links up with Thompson by midday. Marion and Thompson study the ground and identify a defensive position along the river, planning to ambush, harass, and slow the British advance. By evening, small groups led by Thompson launch sudden and pointed attacks against the forward elements under Major William Young. Utilizing the swamps, woods, and narrow trails, Marion's men spring hit-and-run attacks, confusing the British and forcing them to scatter into smaller groups. Musket fire echoes across the marshes as Patriots fire from cover, then vanish back into the undergrowth, further utilizing the ever-effective guerrilla tactics of the South. Young's men were initially confident, but now find themselves bogged down and disoriented, and their advance stalls. For now, they head back to Charleston. March 5th marks a turning point across the Atlantic. In London, Parliament passes a bill authorizing the government to negotiate peace with America. The House of Commons, reeling from Yorktown's losses, votes to end offensive operations in the colonies. Prime Minister Lord North, his government crumbling, resigns just 15 days later on March 20th, Lord Rockingham taking his place. British newspapers from the time report heated debates, with some MPs calling America lost. This shift signals Britain's weakening desire to engage in America, though fighting continues. On March 8th, a dark chapter unfolds in the Ohio County frontier when 160 Pennsylvania militiamen, led by Captain David Williamson, attack a Moravian Christian village of Delaware Indians, also known as the Lenape, who, if you remember our 78 episode, have signed a treaty with the Americans, though the terms are contentious and have gone largely ignored. Although the Moravians and their Indian converts are pacifists who refuse to kill under any circumstances, they do aid the Patriots by working as guides and spies. The militia, however, erroneously suspects the villagers of aiding other tribes allied with the British and rounds up 96 men, women, and children, voting to execute them despite their swearing of no involvement with the British. The victims reportedly sing hymns as they kneel in a barn and are systematically bludgeoned with a mallet. Their bodies are later burned along with the rest of the village, leaving only 2 survivors. Young boys who escape to tell the tale, one of them having been scalped before fleeing. Washington, upon hearing of the massacre, writes to Congress, warning of the likelihood of retaliation by Indians as America is perceived as increasingly untrustworthy. 2 weeks later, in the Kentucky frontier, Native American resistance against American settlers grows more fierce. Alarm bells ring after a Wyandot war party attacks a settlement near Boonesboro, killing a girl and capturing a young boy. In response, Colonel Benjamin Logan orders the local militia to retaliate, and Captain James Estill gathers about 40 militiamen and sets out to track down the raiding party. After several days of pursuit through the rugged terrain, Estill's force catches up to the Wyandots near Little Mountain Creek. The Wyandot party numbers only about 25 warriors, but despite being outnumbered, the Wyandots are determined to stand their ground. On the morning of March 22nd, Estill's men cross Little Mountain Creek and engage the Wyandots. The battle quickly becomes a deadly skirmish across rough woods and thickets, the fighting consisting not of a single charge, but of a prolonged, grueling exchange of musket fire and close quarters combat lasting nearly 2 hours. At first, Estill's militia fights well, managing to hold their ground and even pushing the Wyandots back across the creek. Estill personally leads several charges, however, during the fight, several of Estill's men are killed or wounded and a group of about 6 militiamen breaks off and flees the battlefield. Their desertion tips the balance, and with his numbers suddenly reduced, Astilla's line falters. While trying to rally his men, Astilla is shot through the chest and killed, a devastating blow to the Patriots' fighting spirit. His death collapses the American position, and the remaining militia retreat in disarray, leaving the Wyandots in control of the battlefield. Both of these events on the American frontier highlight a daunting truth. As talks are beginning to end the conflict with Britain, even a successful outcome won't end the fighting in America. The Indians who live on these lands largely see their rights to the land as given from a higher power and are willing to lay down their lives for it. On April 8th, fighting returns to the seas at the Battle of Delaware Bay. An American privateer ship, Hyder Ali, a 16-gun sloop under Captain Joshua Barney, engages the British sloop, General Monk. Using a ruse, Barney lures the British into close range, then unleashes a broadside attack. After a 26-minute fight, the General Monk surrenders, with 20 British dead and 33 wounded. The American crew, suffering only 4 killed, tows their damaged prize back to Philadelphia. Across the Atlantic, April 19th brings another diplomatic milestone. The Netherlands formally recognizes the United States as an independent nation. In The Hague, John Adams, after years of lobbying, secures this recognition from the Dutch States General. The same day, Adams purchases a house in the area and establishes America's first embassy, a vital step in further diplomacy and in establishing roots to ground this fledgling nation. Regarding this recognition, Adams writes to Congress that the American cause now has a home in Europe. In May, Jacob Yoder, a Pennsylvania entrepreneur, makes history in the Monongahela River. Yoder builds an innovative flatboat, loads it with flour, and sails it 2,000 miles to New Orleans, making the first documented commercial voyage from the Ohio Valley to the Gulf. His proving such a journey is possible opens an expedited route for trade, and soon more large flatboats begin to appear on American rivers, efficiently moving supplies needed for expansion and fighting a long distance quickly. Speaking of supply lines, in Nova Scotia, the British retain strongholds that aid in the occupation of New York, as well as the settlement of Canada. For years, American privateers have been launching raids to weaken these lines and add pressure to the loyalist settlements. In late May, privateers attempt incursions into the Minas Basin, planning to seize lightly defended settlements and capture merchant ships. However, British picket ships often spot them early and block their advance, the Northeast still firmly under British control. Beginning on the 25th of May, Colonel William Crawford leads 480 Patriot volunteers in a campaign against British allied native tribes settled along the Sandusky River. The expedition aims to retaliate and curb future raids on the frontier by crippling villages in critical summer months. Crawford's men face overwhelming challenges. Supplies are low, the terrain is disorienting, and Indian scouts, who are far more familiar with this environment, shadow his every movement. On June 4th, Crawford's men clash with a combined force of Shawnee, Delaware, and British Rangers under Captain William Caldwell after being ambushed near the Sandusky villages. A fierce 2-day battle follows, with brutal exchanges of musket fire, sniper fire from cover, and mounted charges through the tall grass. On the 6th, Crawford orders a retreat. It quickly turns into a desperate, disorganized flight through dense forests and swamps, and dozens of men are killed or captured as the retreat scatters the men into small groups. Crawford, exhausted and separated from his men, is captured by Delaware Indians, and in retaliation for the Gnaddenhutton massacre, Crawford is tortured over several hours and then burned at the stake on June 11th near Upper Sandusky. In total, about 70 Americans are killed as a result of the failed campaign, and Washington, in a letter to General Irving, laments the loss, saying, I have been favored with your letter of the 16th June, apprising me of the disaster that befell the militia at Sandusky. I am persuaded you did everything in your power to ensure them success. I cannot but regret the misfortune, and more especially for the loss of Colonel Crawford, for whom I had a very great regard. On June 20th in Philadelphia, Congress formally adopts a design for the Great Seal of the United States, and we're going to deep dive this because I find these things really interesting. Congress had commissioned a seal be made on July 4th of 1776, just a few hours after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, seeing it as an important part of diplomacy and a way to legitimize treaties and other important documents. But for the last 6 years, no agreement was made as to what the seal should represent. Biblical stories being both well-known and dearly held by the founders, Benjamin Franklin proposed a depiction of Moses parting the Red Sea and Pharaoh's chariots being overwhelmed. Wrapping the depiction was the phrase he often repeated, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." The statement being clear, that America, with God's backing, will crush the force pursuing them and achieve divine deliverance. In that same vein, Thomas Jefferson proposed an image of the ancient Israelites escaping Pharaoh led by God's pillar of fire, and a depiction of two Anglo-Saxon warriors from the 5th century, Hengist and Horsa, two brothers who brought their people to England. John Adams envisioned the Greek mythological figure of Hercules having to decide between the female personifications of pleasure and virtue, representing America and the choices before it. Finally, in Outside Consultant, an artist named Pierre-Eugène Ducimetier was asked to design a seal, and his consisted of a shield with 6 symbols representing the European nations of England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Holland, and Germany, the nations that helped settle North America. The shield was flanked by the goddess of liberty and the goddess of justice, and there were 13 gold-linked shields marked with the designation of each of the 13 states. Above the shield was the Eye of Providence, also known as the All-Seeing Eye, a symbol frequently used to represent divine guidance and protection. That summer, a design that combined the ideas of Ducimetier and Franklin was submitted to the Continental Congress. On one side would be the 13 linked shields bearing a state designation, the motto E Pluribus Unum, and 1776 in Roman numerals. On the other side would be Franklin's scene from the Book of Exodus and the motto Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. The design was rejected as it was seen to be too complex, and as the war demanded attention, the discussion was tabled until 1780. When Congress established a new committee to create a seal consisting of James Lovell, John Moran Scott, William Churchill Houston, and Francis Hopkinson as a consultant. Hopkinson is both a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the likely designer of the American flag, as we covered in 77. This committee proposed seals that were similar to those of the first committee. Images of Lady Liberty, warriors, a shield with 13 red and white stripes, constellations of 13 stars, and other similar kinds of images. The Continental Congress rejected these ideas as well, and last month formed a third committee, Charles Thompson and William Barton being the primary contributors. Charles Thompson explained the front of the seal to the Continental Congress, and as we go through it, see if you can count how many times the seal references the 13 states. A defining feature of this Confederation government being a perpetual union between these independent states. The 13 red and white stripes of the shield represent the several states, supporting a blue chief which unites the whole and represents Congress. The colors being adopted from the American flag. White signifies purity and innocence, red, hardiness and valor, and blue, the color of the chief, signifies vigilance, perseverance, and justice. The shield is borne on the breast of an American eagle without any other supporters to denote that the United States of America ought to rely on their own virtue. The olive branch and the arrows denote the power of peace and war. The constellation of 13 stars symbolizes a new nation taking its place among other sovereign states. The motto E pluribus unum, or out of one, many, emblazoned across the scroll and clinched in the eagle's beak, expresses the union of the states. The olive branch contains 13 olives and 13 leaves, and the eagle faces the olive branch rather than the arrows to show America prefers peace, and the eagle is rising to show America as always rising higher. The bald eagle was chosen because it is a native to North America, and eagles represent strength, courage, freedom, and long life. The reverse, sometimes referred to as the spiritual side of the seal, contains the 13-step pyramid with the year 1776 in Roman numerals on the base. At the summit of the pyramid is the Eye of Providence, or the all-seeing eye, in a triangle surrounded by a glory, and above it appears the motto Annuit Coeptis, roughly, he favors. Along the lower circumference of the design appear the words Novus Ordo Seclorum, or New Order of the Ages, heralding the beginning of the new American era. The pyramid is a symbol of strength and duration and is left unfinished to remind succeeding generations that they must build on the foundation they have inherited to keep America a strong and virtuous nation. The seal's first use comes later, but its approval signals a nation defining itself. Benjamin Franklin, for his part, doesn't like the selection of the bald eagle, later saying it is, quote, a bird of bad moral character and a rank coward. He said he would prefer a turkey, as it is a little vain and silly, but ultimately a much more respectable bird and a bird of courage. Continuing through 1782, a bold American privateer raid on Lunenburg, Nova Scotia takes place on July 1st, as Captain Noah Stoddard, commanding a small fleet from Boston, lands 100 men at Lunenburg, and they began plundering the town, seizing supplies and capturing British militia. The raid faces little resistance, and Stoddard's men successfully withdraw before British reinforcements arrive, leaving Lunenburg shaken. Meanwhile, in the south, Savannah is about to be evacuated. Savannah has been serving as a major British stronghold in the south and possesses a critical port, but now is isolated and has seen continuous harassment from local patriots. The French Navy threatens supply ships along the coast, and General Anthony Wayne has been cutting off access to food and supplies on land. Earlier in the year, King George III and the British government instructed commanders to consolidate their remaining forces and abandon indefensible outposts, and British Commander General Alyard Clark recognizes that Savannah cannot be held without massive reinforcements, which he knows are not coming. So on July 11th, British forces began orderly evacuating, bringing an end to 3 years of occupation. Royal Governor James Wright and a few officers head to Charleston, while British regulars head to New York, and a mixed group of Rangers and Indians head south to the Loyalist refuge of St. Augustine. On August 7th, George Washington creates the Badge of Military Merit to honor soldiers' bravery, and soon awards the new badge, which is a purple cloth with a heart-shaped border, to 3 sergeants for gallantry, marking the first military decoration ever presented. It's interesting to note the 3 soldiers Washington's Purple Heart was awarded to are the only known soldiers to receive this decoration during the Revolutionary War, their names being Elijah Churchill, William Brown, and Daniel Bissell Jr. Churchill was wounded while leading a whaleboat raid against Fort Slongo on October 2nd in 1781. His men destroyed artillery and ammunition and took 21 prisoners in the successful action. It seems we don't know much about Brown, and the name is a common one, but if he is the same Captain William Brown whose coat was donated to Drexel University, then it's safe to say he helped to organize and execute the crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas Day in 76. And while many patriots continued to fight alongside Washington at the battles of Trenton and Princeton, Captain Brown was ordered to return to Philadelphia as a last hope for protection in the case the Continental Army suffered a defeat at Trenton. Bissell's life is well documented by comparison, and in summer of last year he was dispatched on a secret mission by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harrison, one of Washington's aides-de-camp, to pose as a deserter and gather intelligence on British military strength in New York City, presumably with a view of utilizing it in formulating a plan of attack. He joined the American Legion, the combined infantry and cavalry unit commanded by none other than Brigadier General Benedict Arnold. After presenting this honor to the three men we just mentioned, the Book of Merit meant to record recipients was lost, and the decoration was largely forgotten for over 140 years. Now, let's head back to the District of Kentucky, where at the frontier settlement of Bryan Station, a combined force of about 300 Native American warriors, mostly Shawnee and Mingo, joined by another 300 loyalist rangers under the notorious Captain William Caldwell and Simon Girty, descend upon the isolated stockade on August 15th. Scouts spot signs of enemy movement, and those staying in Bryan Station, around 40 men and their families, prepare for a desperate defense. Knowing they must maintain their water supply to survive an extended siege, the women of Bryan Station perform an extraordinary act of bravery, walking calmly to the nearby spring, fully exposed to a potential attack, and retrieve water while the enemy watches. Their calmness convinces the attackers that the station is too well prepared to be surprised, forcing Caldwell and Girty to delay their full assault. Throughout the day, skirmishing erupts around the palisades as native warriors and loyalist rangers harass the station with musket fire and try to set fire to the wooden walls. The defenders respond with steady gunfire, managing to prevent a breach. A messenger escapes and heads to nearby militia leaders in a desperate bid to receive reinforcements. Throughout the 16th, the small contingent are able to hold out, while Patriot reinforcements rally and plan their counter-assault. The next morning, still unable to breach the perimeter of Bryan Station, Caldwell decides to withdraw before any reinforcements can arrive. Kentucky militia leaders, including Colonel John Todd, Colonel Stephen Trigg, and the legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone, organize a pursuit of the retreating native and British forces. Their force numbers around 180 men, mostly volunteers from the Lexington area, and they head out, crossing the Kentucky wilderness at speed. The militia reaches the banks of the lower Blue Licks by August 18th, and there, scouts observe signs of the enemy crossing the river. Boone and a few experienced leaders feel that it may be a trap, noting the suspicious absence of enemy forces and the favorable terrain for an ambush. Boone tells his men to keep their guard up and suggests waiting for reinforcements under Colonel Benjamin Logan, who is marching from south-central Kentucky with several hundred more men to arrive before pushing on. Younger officers, however, particularly Major Hugh McGarry, press for immediate action and accuse the others of cowardice. McGarry dramatically fords the river on horseback, shouting for the men to follow him. Whether pressured by pride or fear of losing the enemy, the result is the same, and the militia crosses the river without proper reconnaissance. As the Americans advance up a rocky ridge, the trap springs shut, and Caldwell's warriors and rangers, hidden behind dense thickets and ravines, unleash a devastating volley of musket fire. Shocked and disorganized, the Patriot militia staggers, allowing native warriors to quickly envelop both American flanks, cutting off any possibility of a group retreat. In the chaos, Colonel Todd is shot down early, followed by Colonel Trigg, who also falls under heavy fire. Daniel Boone fights desperately to rally a defense, but is forced to retreat when he realizes the battle is lost. Tragically, his son, Israel Boone, is killed during the retreat. Only about 70 of the 180 men escape. Over 110 are killed, including many of Kentucky's most experienced frontier leaders. The defeat is a catastrophic blow to the fragile frontier settlements who counted on these brave men, leaving many communities temporarily defenseless. When Colonel Logan finally arrives days later, he is of course too late to save the force. He helps to recover and bury the dead, many of whom are mutilated, as those wounded and abandoned during the retreat were later killed by bayonet or tomahawk. Beyond the world of orderly conflicts and treaties, the frontier is becoming the home of especially violent clashes between the Indians and the Americans. On August 27th in South Carolina, Colonel John Lawrence, with 100 Patriot cavalry, ambushes a British foraging party near the Combahee Ferry. The Patriots strike swiftly, killing about 15 British soldiers and capturing several more, but Lawrence falls in the fighting. Another significant loss for the Patriot cause. On September 6th, Thomas Jefferson's wife, Martha, dies at Monticello. Her death hits Jefferson hard, and he becomes a shut-in for weeks. He burns her letters looking to preserve his personal memory of her, and eventually pens a letter to his sister-in-law, where he describes his feelings in the weeks since her passing. I find the following passage to be particularly humanizing and wanted to include it as it's easy to remember these founders as stoic legends rather than people just like you and I. This miserable kind of existence is really too burdensome to be borne, and were it not for the infidelity of deserting the sacred charge left me, I could not wish its continuance a moment. For what could be wished? All my plans of comfort and happiness reversed by a single instant, and nothing answering in prospect before me but a gloom unbrightened with one cheerful expectation. The care and instruction of our children indeed affords some temporary abstractions from wretchedness and nourishes a soothing reflection that if there be beyond the grave any concern for the things of this world, there is one angel at least who views these attentions with pleasure and wishes continuance of them, while she must pity the miseries to which they confine me. Elsewhere, in the Ohio Valley, Captain Samuel Mason, with 40 Patriots, is stationed at Fort Henry, which stands as one of the last strongholds against Indian and loyalist attacks. On September 11th, 300 British Allied Indians, led by Captain Andrew Bratt, march toward the settlement, many of these fighters having earlier attempted the siege at Bryan Station. They are spotted by John Lynn, an American scout, a few hours before they reach Fort Henry, giving the inhabitants time to flee to the fort and man the walls. Ebenezer Zane elects to remain in his fortified house along with a few family members, friends, and 2 slaves, while his brother Silas takes command of the fort. Silas has fewer than 20 men to defend the fort, while roughly 40 women and children are sheltered inside. The men under Bratt form lines around the garrison and demand the fort to be surrendered, which is refused. They then escalate to attempting to take the force by fort while under fire from the defenders inside. As night falls, they make efforts to set the fort on fire but are driven back by focused musket fire. By morning the next day, most of the powder has been spent, and Betty Zane, the teenage sister of Silas and Ebenezer, volunteers to resupply the men with the stores of powder from Ebenezer's block house. Accounts vary, and the whole event is subject to a bit of folklore, but sticking to the facts, the house is between 40 and 70 yards away. To objections that a man could run faster, she is supposed to have replied, "You have not one man to spare. A woman will not be missed in the defense of the fort." At noon, the gates are unbarred, and Betty dashes for the house. The attackers jeer at her but do not fire. However, when she comes running back from the house with a supply of gunpowder, they realize she's attempting to supply the fort and open fire. She makes it back and is locked back inside the fort walls, avoiding so much as a scratch, heart surely pounding as she presents the men with all the powder she could carry. By evening, Bratt makes another assault on the fort and is again driven back thanks to the resupply of powder. And by dawn of the next morning, he withdraws his forces totally. On September 14th, General George Washington stands at Verplanck's Point along the Hudson River in New York to review the French army under General Rochambeau. The event is designed to be a grand display of the French-American alliance and their continued strength after the victory at Yorktown. 5,000 French soldiers march past in precise formation, their bright white uniforms contrasting with the rough, homespun clothing of many American militiamen who look on from the sidelines. The French regiments, polished and disciplined, present a striking image of European military professionalism that awes the American spectators and soldiers alike. The sound of fifes and drums fills the air, playing French military tunes as the troops pass in columns before the American commander-in-chief, and Washington returns their salutes with dignity. Later that day, Washington writes to Congress describing the review with pride and emphasizing the unity and readiness of American and French forces to continue the fight, should the war not swiftly conclude. 2 days later, the Great Seal of the United States is used for the first time, when it is pressed into red wax on a parchment document authorizing George Washington to negotiate the exchange of prisoners with the British. Currently, there are thousands of Americans being held on prison ships and experiencing grueling conditions. As we've said before, nearly half of the men being held prisoner die of disease, starvation, neglect, or serious physical abuse. The British still see those captured as rebels and traitors, not prisoners of war, and as such, little is done to ensure their survival. On November 30th in Paris, the American negotiating team of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay sits across the table from Richard Oswald, the British envoy empowered by Prime Minister Lord Shelburne to find a settlement with America. The Americans insist on their core demands: full and unconditional recognition of American independence and favorable territorial boundaries. Franklin, always cautious but firm, reminds the British that the Americans shall insist on the full enjoyment of those rights without exception or diminution. John Jay pushes aggressively for American interests, particularly regarding the Mississippi River. The British, though reluctant, understand the strategic necessity of peace. Britain is exhausted from years of war, facing not just rebellion in America, but also pressure from Spain and France and the Netherlands. Oswald, for his part, shows considerable flexibility during the discussions. The resulting preliminary articles are remarkably generous to the United States. The British formally recognize American independence, not as part of a larger peace settlement with France or Spain, but directly and unequivocally. American territory is set to extend from the Atlantic Ocean westward to the Mississippi River, and from the Great Lakes in the north to Florida in the south. One of the more delicate issues, loyalist property and debts, is handled with careful language. The Americans agree only to recommend to their state legislatures that property confiscated from loyalists can be returned, but they make no guarantees, allowing the Americans to secure British recognition without alienating their own populations who have no sympathy for loyalists. The articles, signed but as of yet not formalized, mark the war's diplomatic endgame, which we'll cover more tomorrow. Word that preliminary peace talks are underway reaches General Alexander Leslie, the British commander in Charleston, and he prepares for the evacuation of the city. Nathanael Greene is similarly made aware ahead of the formal approval of these talks and heads to Charleston, arriving just as the British leave, and ensures Patriots retake control of the town and thus South Carolina's largest port. Civilians across the country are still dealing with the after effects of the war. Though there is a pause in active fighting, many communities are struggling to rebuild after years of conflict. Scarcity of goods, inflation, and the widespread devastation left by the war affects daily life, making the season a bittersweet one for many families. General George Washington and his Continental Army are encamped at Newburgh, New York. Washington is still concerned about the financial stability of the new nation and about maintaining the Army's loyalty. Congress has yet to resolve the issues with supplying and paying his troops. A group of senior Continental Army officers, including Major General Alexander McDougall, Colonel John Brooks, and Colonel Matthias Ogden, deliver a memorandum to the Confederation Congress. It asks for an option for a lump sum payment for their pensions and back pay instead of lifetime payments. It also expresses their distress over their lack of pay. Included in this memorandum is also a veiled threat saying, any further experiments on the Army's patients may have fatal effects. Well, that's it for this year. As 1782 closes, the Revolution's nature has shifted. While some hostilities remain, they shift increasingly to the frontier, where Indians fight to repel westward expansion. America is deepening its roots and forging its identity through both victory and tragedies. A war for independence raging for well over 7 years is winding down, but what will be done with the newly earned freedom is an open question. Next, in 1783, debates in Congress over the state of the Army, a conspiracy, and a treaty. Check out our X at 250 Years of USA for maps, portraits, and documents from 1782, including the Great Seal's proposed designs and a photo of Washington's Purple Heart. If you're enjoying the show, please help me out by reviewing the show, subscribing, or liking. It costs you nothing at all and helps me to continue to spread this show to new listeners. And get in contact. Tell me what you learned, what you enjoyed, or what we missed. This has been Our Story, 250 years of the United States of America. And as always, thanks for listening.